This is completely unacceptable. We need this cleared now.
Ma'am, we're working as fast as we can. The ground is unstable.
I don't care. Get it done. Let's move. Time is critical. Stay alert. We can't afford delays. We did it. This victory belongs to every one of you. Together, we will continue to build a stronger community.
The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from a letter, a phone call, or even a knock at the door. It came from the sound of heavy machinery tearing into land that had been quiet for decades. Acres of open property, untouched except for the occasional survey stake and wildlife trail, suddenly became a full-scale construction zone. Bulldozers carved roads. Concrete trucks poured foundations. Framing went up fast, too fast for something that had never been approved by the actual owner. That owner was me. At first, it was easy to assume it was a mistake, a contractor error, a boundary confusion, something that would be corrected the moment paperwork was checked. After all, large developments didn't just appear out of nowhere. There were supposed to be permits, title searches, surveys, and legal reviews. Entire teams of professionals were paid to make sure this exact situation never happened. And yet, the HOA had done exactly that. They built an entire neighborhood on land they did not own. 6 homes. The homeowners association behind the project wasn't small or inexperienced. It was run like a corporation, complete with a CEO, style board president, legal counsel on retainer, and a reputation for being aggressive, confident, and relentless. This was the kind of HOA that bullied homeowners over paint shades and grass length, then bragged about it in newsletters. Power was their currency, and they spent it freely. When construction began, I watched carefully. Survey flags were planted far beyond where they should have been. Roads cut through parcels I personally paid taxes on. Drainage systems redirected water across my land without so much as a courtesy notice. Each day, the development grew larger, louder, and more permanent. Behind the scenes, the HOA leadership was celebrating. This project was their crown jewel, a major expansion that would increase Du's influence and property values. Board members toured the site regularly, posing for photos, congratulating each other, and boasting about how smoothly everything was going. They spoke at city meetings with confidence bordering on arrogance, presenting themselves as visionaries reshaping the community. What they didn't realize was that their entire success rested on a single assumption, that the land was theirs. It wasn't. The deed sat quietly in a file, clean and indisputable, recorded years before any of them ever imagined building there. No easements, no transfers, no agreements, just ownership clear as day. Somewhere along the line, a title search failed, or worse, was never done properly. And instead of catching the mistake early, the HOA doubled down, pouring millions of dollars into concrete, lumber, and celebration. I didn't stop them. That was the part no one expected. Instead of rushing to court, instead of sending cease and desist letters, instead of throwing myself in front of excavators, I waited. I documented everything, every foundation poured, every structure completed, every permit posted that conveniently avoided mentioning my name. I watched the HOA leadership grow bolder with each milestone, mistaking my silence for weakness or ignorance. Posting updates and praising the project's success, he spoke of strength and leadership, using bold language to drown out doubt. Internally, however, his grip was slipping. Legal counsel grew increasingly cautious, issuing warnings that were ignored or minimized. Each ignored warning would later become ammunition. Tensions escalated into outright hostility during board reviews. Meetings ran long, unproductive, and bitter. Members who suggested reaching out to the landowner were overruled or sidelined. The idea that someone outside the HOA could outmaneuver them was unacceptable to leadership. Pride took precedence over prudence. What none of them realized was that the situation had already passed the point of quiet resolution. Construction liens were being finalized. Mortgages were queued. Buyers were emotionally and financially invested. The development was no longer just an HOA project. It was a legal minefield involving lenders, insurers, and future homeowners who had no idea they were about to step into the middle of a property war. And still, I waited. The longer the HOA delayed acknowledgement, the stronger my position became. Their internal chaos was proof of negligence. Their infighting was evidence of mismanagement. Every angry email, every ignored memo, every power struggle among leadership would eventually surface. By the end of the week, the CEO-style president finally acknowledged what he could no longer suppress. The land issue was real, it was serious, and it threatened everything they had built, literally. But acknowledgement did not bring humility. It brought desperation. And desperation, when mixed with power, rarely leads to wise decisions. Once the HOA leadership accepted that the land problem could no longer be buried, their strategy shifted from denial to domination. The internal fighting didn't stop, but it became focused. The CEO-style president framed the situation as a threat that needed to be neutralized quickly, quietly, and forcefully. In his view, ownership was no longer about legal truth. It was about who could apply the most pressure. The first move wasn't legal. It was psychological. Notices were drafted asserting long-standing control of the property. Internal memos reframed the situation as a boundary dispute rather than outright trespass. The HOA's leadership convinced themselves that repetition could replace reality. If they said it often enough, loudly enough, maybe the land would somehow become theirs through sheer confidence. Behind the scenes, legal counsel urged caution. They warned that aggressive posturing without documentation would only worsen the exposure. Those warnings were met with hostility. The board president viewed hesitation as betrayal. Anyone who questioned the approach was accused of undermining the OA's authority and jeopardizing the community's future. The quarrels grew vicious. Board members clashed over tone and tactics. Some wanted to negotiate quietly. Others feared lawsuits from homeowners more than from the landowner. The president dismissed all of it, consolidating decision-making power and pushing forward with a campaign of intimidation disguised as governance. That campaign eventually reached me. Formal letters arrived, heavy with legal language and empty threats. They claimed implied consent, adverse possession, and administrative oversight, all arguments that fell apart under even minimal scrutiny. The HOA demanded recognition of their development rights and framed the construction as a benefit bestowed upon unused land. What they failed to understand was that intimidation only works when the target is uncertain. I wasn't. Every threat they issued became another piece of evidence. Their own words revealed recklessness, entitlement, and a refusal to acknowledge basic property law. The more they escalated, the clearer it became that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a power grab. Inside the OA, cracks turned into fractures. The CEO-style president's aggressive stance alienated key allies. Board members who had supported him early on began distancing themselves, quietly documenting their objections. Some feared personal liability. Others feared being sacrificed if the situation collapsed. The fighting spilled into committees and management teams. Accusations of incompetence flew. People scrambled to protect themselves, saving emails, printing documents, and recording meeting minutes with newfound precision. Everyone sensed the same thing: when this ended, someone would be blamed. The development itself became a symbol of arrogance. Rows of empty homes sat ready for occupancy, but uncertainty froze progress. Lenders hesitated. Insurance providers asked uncomfortable questions. Title companies refused to proceed without clarification. The HOA leadership responded by pushing harder. They publicly reaffirmed ownership claims. They attempted to pressure local officials. They leaned on relationships built over years of compliance enforcement and political donations. But influence could not rewrite recorded deeds. And then, finally, they made the mistake that changed everything. The HOA authorized legal action without resolving the underlying ownership issue. They filed motions asserting rights they could not prove, committing their claims to permanent record. In doing so, they locked themselves into a position that would be impossible to retreat from without humiliation. The president celebrated this move internally, presenting it as a show of strength. He framed it as the moment the HOA took control of the narrative. Applause followed, though it was thinner than before. What he didn't realize was that by forcing the issue into court, he had handed me the stage. No more letters, no more posturing, no more intimidation, just evidence. And the evidence was devastating. The courtroom stripped away everything the HOA leadership relied on. There were no board titles, no newsletters, no compliance notices, and no intimidation tactics that carried weight inside those walls. Authority there belonged only to facts, records, and the people brave enough to stand behind them under oath. From the moment proceedings began, the imbalance between confidence and reality became impossible to ignore. The HOA arrived projecting certainty. Their legal team organized stacks of documents meant to suggest legitimacy through volume rather than substance. Maps were presented that relied on outdated assumptions. Arguments leaned heavily on intent, community benefit, and administrative momentum. The underlying message was clear: the development existed, therefore it must be allowed to continue. But existence is not ownership. When my documentation entered the record, the tone shifted. Clean title history, certified surveys, tax payment records spanning years without interruption. Each piece aligned perfectly, telling a simple story the HOA could not complicate. The land had never changed hands, it had never been authorized for development, and it had never belonged to anyone else. Under scrutiny, the HOA's narrative began to unravel. Their CEO-style president, so dominant in meetings and public forums, looked diminished in a space where confidence had to be earned rather than asserted. His internal fights with board members now echoed indirectly through inconsistencies in filings and testimony. Every shortcut taken during development surfaced as a liability. The infighting that once happened behind closed doors now mattered. Emails revealed disagreement. Meeting minutes showed objections ignored. Legal warnings that had been dismissed were suddenly relevant. What had once been brushed off as internal politics became evidence of recklessness. The HOA's legal strategy fractured under its own weight. They attempted to pivot from ownership to necessity, from necessity to equity, and from equity to economic harm. Each shift weakened their credibility. Courts do not reward improvisation when the law is clear. Meanwhile, pressure mounted from all sides. Homebuyers, previously invisible in the dispute, began to loom large. Their financial futures were tied to a development built on land without legal foundation. Lenders grew nervous. Insurance companies withdrew coverage. The HOA board faced mounting panic as the consequences extended far beyond fines or delays. Inside the organization, the fighting intensified. Board members quietly distanced themselves from the president, positioning him as the architect of the disaster. Support evaporated. The very people who once applauded his decisiveness now prepared for fallout. The president responded the only way he knew how, by doubling down. He pushed his attorneys to challenge established boundaries, to argue technicalities no longer supported by evidence. He resisted settlement discussions, viewing compromise as weakness. His refusal to acknowledge defeat turned a manageable crisis into an existential threat for the HOA. The court did not share his enthusiasm. With each session, it became clear that the HOA's position was untenable. Their arguments failed to overcome the simplicity of recorded ownership. No amount of development, no scale of investment, and no display of authority could retroactively grant rights they never possessed. The power dynamics shifted completely. What had started as a confident display by a dominant HOA leadership ended as a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. The courtroom became a mirror, reflecting years of unchecked arrogance and internal dysfunction back at those who enabled it. As proceedings moved toward resolution, one truth stood above all others. The HOA's greatest mistake wasn't building on land they didn't own. It was believing they could bully reality into changing. The moment the court's direction became unmistakable, the HOA stopped acting like a unified organization and started behaving like a group of individuals scrambling to survive. The illusion of collective strength shattered. What remained was fear, resentment, and an urgent need to assign blame before consequences became permanent. The CEO-style president, once untouchable, found himself isolated. Board members who had followed his lead now questioned his judgment openly, at least behind closed doors. The aggressive posture he had insisted upon no longer looked bold, it looked reckless. Every decision he had forced through now carried legal and financial weight, and the organization could no longer pretend those costs were abstract. Internal quarrels escalated into outright warfare. Emergency meetings were called not to solve the problem, but to protect reputations. Directors argued over insurance coverage, indemnification clauses, and personal liability. Some demanded resignation. Others pushed for damage control strategies designed to minimize individual exposure rather than save the HOA as a whole. Trust evaporated almost overnight. The development, once a symbol of success, became a liability too large to ignore. 96 homes stood in limbo, finished but unusable. Utilities existed in a legal gray area. Municipal agencies distanced themselves, unwilling to be entangled in a dispute rooted in negligence. The HOA's finances buckled under the strain of legal fees, halted sales, and looming restitution. And the homeowners, the people the HOA claimed to protect, began asking questions. Those questions carried weight. Buyers wanted answers about ownership, titles, and refunds. Lenders demanded assurances that could not be given. The HOA's silence only fueled suspicion, and the narrative spun beyond their control. What had once been framed as a minor dispute now looked like systemic failure. Inside leadership, survival instincts dominated. Board members began documenting dissent retroactively, revising meeting minutes and clarifying positions in writing. Some quietly sought separate legal counsel. Others pushed to cooperate with investigations, hoping transparency would shield them from the worst outcomes. The president resisted all of it, clinging to authority that no longer existed. His refusal to step aside deepened the chaos. Instead of unifying the HOA, his presence became a catalyst for further division. Accusations surfaced that he had ignored early warnings, overridden professional advice, and prioritized expansion over legality. Each accusation was met with denial, but denial no longer carried influence. The court's pressure accelerated everything. Deadlines approached, options narrowed. Settlement discussions resurfaced, no longer framed as negotiation but as damage mitigation. The HOA had lost leverage. The only question remaining was how much of the fallout could be contained, and who would bear the cost. Meanwhile, my position remained unchanged. Ownership did not fluctuate with emotion or politics. The land was still mine. The documentation still held. The HOA's internal collapse only reinforced the strength of that reality. Every fractured alliance and panicked maneuver underscored how preventable the situation had been. By the end of the chapter, the HOA faced a stark truth. The fight was no longer about winning. It was about surviving what came next. The development could not move forward. The leadership could not remain intact. And the consequences of building first and verifying later were finally unavoidable. The reckoning they had delayed was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. By the time the final ruling approached, there was nothing left of the HOA's former confidence. The aggressive posturing, the public optimism, and the internal power plays had all collapsed under the weight of reality. What remained was a fractured organization facing consequences it could no longer delay, negotiate away, or intimidate into submission. The court's findings were precise and unforgiving. Ownership was affirmed without ambiguity. The development had been constructed on land the HOA never possessed legal rights to use. Every attempt to justify the project through necessity, intent, or scale failed against the clarity of recorded fact. The ruling didn't dramatize the error. It documented it line by line, transforming arrogance into a permanent legal record. The impact was immediate. The HOA's authority dissolved overnight. The board's structure unraveled as resignations followed one after another. Insurance coverage proved inadequate for the scope of liability. Financial reserves vanished under the combined weight of legal judgments, remediation requirements, and restitution. What had once been a powerful association now struggled to function at even the most basic level. The CEO-style president's fall was swift and final. Stripped of influence, isolated from former allies, and tied directly to the decisions that caused the collapse, he became the focal point of accountability. The same leadership style that once propelled him forward now worked against him. Control without caution had left nowhere to hide. The organization he had dominated moved on, without him reshaping itself in an attempt to survive the aftermath. The development itself became a monument to failure. 96 homes, fully built yet legally stranded, stood as evidence of what happens when assumption replaces verification. Resolving their future required time, oversight, and resources far beyond what the HOA could manage alone. External administrators stepped in, processes slowed, every step forward required approval, documentation, and transparency that had been missing from the beginning. For the homeowners and buyers, the resolution brought mixed emotions. Relief that the truth was settled. Frustration at the delays and uncertainty. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to restore. The HOA's reputation suffered lasting damage, extending far beyond this single development. And for me, the outcome was exactly what the law had promised all along. Ownership was respected, rights were enforced. The system functioned as it was meant to, even if it took the collapse of unchecked authority to make it happen. The silence I had maintained throughout the chaos proved more powerful than confrontation ever could have been. The final lesson was impossible to ignore. Power without accountability is temporary. Authority without verification is fragile, and building something, no matter how large, on assumptions rather than facts guarantees failure. The HOA learned that lesson at extraordinary cost. The land remained unchanged, indifferent to ego, ambition, or celebration. It waited patiently while confidence crumbled and structures lost meaning. In the end, ownership wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was simply true.